Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my commentary today. The November 30th report said that the war in Ukraine has crossed a threshold that the international community can no longer pretend to overlook. The attacks on a Black Sea oil tanker and on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities at Novorossiysk are not merely tactical strikes or symbolic gestures. They represent a deliberate shift toward targeting the arteries of global energy security, assets that until now remained largely protected even in the darkest moments. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova underscored this point with unusual clarity. These are not isolated incidents, she argued, but terrorist attacks hitting civilian energy infrastructure essential for the world economy. Her warning carries weight not only because Moscow is a direct stakeholder, but because the CPC system is shared by Kazakhstan, Turkey, and multiple global markets far beyond the Russian-Ukrainian battlefield. When Kazakhstan publicly condemns the assault and when Turkey signals concern, it reveals the uncomfortable truth. This conflict is no longer a contained regional war. It is beginning to interfere with the logistics that keep Europe, Asia, and the broader global economy functioning. Energy flows are the bloodstream of modern civilization. When they are struck, the consequences quickly ripple across continents. What makes this escalation especially dangerous is that it violates an unwritten moral and strategic norm. Even during the Cold War, when nuclear arsenals hung over humanity like a sword, energy systems were too vital, too interconnected, too essential to be dragged into the politics of destruction. By attacking tankers and pipeline terminals, Kiev and the Western intelligence networks believed to support such operations are signaling a willingness to break that taboo. The attacks on the Black Sea tanker and the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities have forced Russia into a strategic crossroads that is deeper and more consequential than the rhetoric of its foreign ministry reveals. Beneath Zakharova's sharp condemnation lies a more complex struggle. The Kremlin must now decide whether to preserve its long-standing posture of calibrated restraint or whether the moment has arrived to demonstrate that targeting global energy arteries carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. This is not merely a military calculation, it is a question of global responsibility, deterrence, credibility, and moral positioning in a world already strained by conflict. From Moscow's perspective, the pattern is unmistakable. Over the past year, Ukraine has gradually expanded the range of targets it is willing to strike, often with the tacit or explicit support of Western intelligence systems, reconnaissance drones, and long-range enablers. Each strike appears designed to probe Russian thresholds, to test how far the Kremlin will tolerate attacks on infrastructure essential not only to Russia but to international markets. And each time Russia responds with diplomacy rather than decisive retaliation, it risks sending a message of permissiveness. This dynamic now confronts Moscow with an uncomfortable truth. Restraint can sometimes invite greater danger. If Ukrainian strikes on energy infrastructure become normalized, the entire Black Sea and Caspian region could turn into an arena where pipelines, tankers, and terminals become acceptable military targets. Such a precedent would be catastrophic for a global economy already navigating inflation, energy shortages, and geopolitical fragmentation. Yet retaliation carries its own risks. A large-scale Russian response, particularly one involving naval assets or long-range precision strikes, would not only escalate the conflict but could draw NATO into closer confrontation, intentional or otherwise. The Black Sea is a crowded geopolitical space. Turkey monitors every movement. Romania and Bulgaria sit under NATO's umbrella. Kazakhstan relies on the CPC as its economic lifeline, and global insurers track every tanker route with rising concern. A Russian military escalation would send immediate shockwaves through markets, diplomacy, and alliances. This is the essence of Moscow's dilemma. To act decisively is dangerous, but to remain passive may be even more so. The Kremlin understands that its deterrence posture, its credibility as a major power, relies on more than rhetoric. It depends on its ability to protect national and shared energy infrastructure and to signal clearly where the boundaries of acceptable warfare lie. If Moscow chooses to abandon restraint, the mechanisms of retaliation are already in place. Russia possesses the naval, aerospace, and missile capabilities to launch a retaliatory campaign that would redefine the tempo and geography of the war. Yet the deeper question is not whether Russia can strike back, but whether it should. Throughout the conflict, Russia has maintained a posture of measured escalation, using long-range strikes, selectively avoiding dramatic operations in the Black Sea, and keeping its most advanced capabilities in reserve. This restraint has been deliberate. The Kremlin understands that a major attack on Ukraine's coastal infrastructure, naval assets, or command nodes would reverberate far beyond Kyiv. It would be interpreted in Western capitals as a shift toward a far more aggressive Russian doctrine, one that blurs the line between battlefield targets and strategic pressure. Yet military planners in Moscow cannot ignore what is happening. The Black Sea Fleet, though restructured after the earlier phase of the war, still commands formidable systems, caliber cruise missiles, Bastion coastal defense complexes, two 22 M3 long-range bombers, hypersonic Kinzhal carriers, and a network of reconnaissance drones that continuously monitor Ukrainian movements. These tools enable Russia not only to retaliate, but to do so at a scale Ukraine has not yet experienced since the early months of the conflict. Potential targets are diverse. Russia could strike key Ukrainian ports, logistical hubs supporting drone operations, naval repair facilities, or coastal missile batteries. Such strikes would send a clear message that attacks on energy infrastructure, whether Russian or multinational, carry costs that Ukraine and its partners cannot easily absorb. But the military dimension is only part of the equation. What makes this moment so perilous is that a large-scale Russian response could trigger cascading reactions, tighter NATO surveillance, accelerated Ukrainian requests for long-range weapons, and a growing risk that miscalculation in the Black Sea leads to direct confrontation between nuclear-armed actors. The navigation lanes that carry grain, oil, and commercial goods could overnight become a militarized zone governed by fear and uncertainty. In that sense, Russia's military power is both a shield and a burden. To use it decisively would demonstrate strength, but it would also risk destabilizing a delicate international environment. The attacks on Black Sea tankers and the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities have opened a new and deeply troubling chapter in the Ukraine war: the weaponization of global energy arteries. These are not ordinary assets. They form the circulatory system of modern civilization. Oil shipments through the Black Sea and exports via the CPC terminal in Novorossiysk sustain trade between Europe and East Asia. When such nodes come under attack, the geopolitical map shifts and the world is forced to confront a new reality. The front line is no longer defined by trenches and borders, but by pipelines, tankers, and maritime chokepoints. This is why Kazakhstan's reaction was so immediate and unambiguous. For Astana, the CPC is not simply a commercial project, it is the backbone of its economic sovereignty. Nearly 80% of Kazakhstan's oil exports flow through this system. A strike on the terminal is, in effect, a strike on the country's national stability. Turkey, too, has its own reasons for alarm. Ankara sits at the nexus of Black Sea trade. Any disruption risks triggering a regional crisis that Turkey cannot afford politically or economically. The danger extends well beyond these states. If attacks on energy infrastructure become normalized in warfare, global markets would be thrust into a state of chronic instability. The world already faces inflationary pressures, supply chain fragility, and social unrest driven by rising living costs. A disruption in the Black Sea or Caspian region would drive oil prices upward, destabilize currencies, and strain the fragile political balance. In other words, the consequences would not stop at Moscow or Kiev. They would reverberate through Berlin, New Delhi, Beijing, and countless capitals in between. This is why the emerging precedent is so alarming. Throughout the Cold War, even during moments of peak confrontation, both superpowers recognized the moral and practical imperative to shield civilian energy infrastructure from attack. The logic was clear. Societies depend on energy as they depend on water, food, and medicine. To weaponize it would be to declare war not only on an adversary, but eventually on the global system itself. But that firewall is now eroding. Each successful attack on an energy node, no matter how surgically executed, signals to other actors that such targets are fair game. This erosion of norms threatens to usher in a new class of geopolitical risk, a world where no tanker is safe, no pipeline is sacred, and no port is beyond reach. Once the international community allows energy infrastructure to become a battlefield, it becomes exponentially harder to restore. Mistrust spreads. As the dust settles over the latest attacks in the Black Sea and Novorossiysk, one question now looms over the entire conflict. Will Russia respond not merely with tactical strikes, but with a new doctrine, one that redefines the rules of modern warfare around the protection of energy infrastructure? This possibility, once unthinkable, now feels increasingly plausible, and if it happens, it would mark one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts since the end of the Cold War. From Moscow's perspective, the logic is straightforward. If Ukraine, backed by Western intelligence, training, and advanced targeting systems, continues striking civilian energy nodes, then Russia may feel compelled to codify a harsher and more explicit deterrent. Such a doctrine would not be symbolic rhetoric. It would represent a formal declaration that any future attack on its energy lifelines or on internationally shared infrastructure such as the CPC constitutes an assault on global stability itself, and that such an attack will invite a disproportionate military response calibrated not only to punish but to deter any repetition. This would signal the emergence of what analysts might call an energy red line doctrine. Its purpose would be dual: to warn Kyiv and its Western supporters, and to reassure partners like Kazakhstan, Turkey, and China that Russia sees itself as a custodian, not a destroyer, of regional energy security. In the Russian view, it is Ukraine and its backers who have blurred the line between military and civilian targets. A doctrine would thus allow Moscow to reposition itself as both defender and enforcer of long-standing international norms. But a doctrine of this magnitude carries risks. If Russia asserts that future attacks on energy infrastructure will be met with unprecedented force, global markets will react instantly. Insurance rates for Black Sea shipping will spike. European energy planners will scramble. Asian importers will reassess their supply routes. Even the hint of an escalatory posture could send oil prices soaring, affecting everything from consumer inflation to political stability in vulnerable nations. And yet Russia may argue that the alternative, doing nothing, is even more dangerous. If Moscow fails to establish its red line, then the attacks on tankers, terminals, and pipelines will continue, perhaps even expand. A world in which energy infrastructure becomes a common target is one living under a permanent threat of economic paralysis. When diplomacy fails to protect global public goods, great powers feel compelled to impose order by force. But force, even when intended as deterrence, carries a tragic duality. It may restore temporary stability, or it may ignite a chain reaction that future generations will struggle to contain. Ultimately, the coming months may reveal more than Russia's next military move. They may reveal whether the world is entering an era in which global energy arteries, once ruled by restraint and common interest, are now governed by missiles, drones, and coercive doctrines, and if that transformation begins in the Black Sea, it will not remain confined there. It will echo across oceans, markets, and the fragile architecture of international peace. In this sense, Moscow's decision will shape not only the war in Ukraine, but the security landscape of the 21st century. Thank you for watching.